A cup of tea. Just one single cup of tea with death waiting inside it. The man who brewed that tea was no stranger off the street. Not a hired killer. Not an enemy. He had lived in that house for 8 years, eaten at the same table, been handed the keys to every room, trusted with every secret the family held. And that cup of tea, he made it for the very person who had treated him like her own flesh and blood. He had calculated everything. The timing, the dosage, the escape route. He had waited months for this one perfect moment. And that moment had finally arrived. The cup was placed on the table. The intended victim sat down, reached for it just 1 second away from drinking. But right then, a 4-year-old child ran into the room, grabbed the old woman's hand, and said, "Nana, come see the butterflies in the garden with me." Just one innocent sentence from a child. That was all it took. And that cup of tea never touched the lips of the person it was brewed to destroy. But the story doesn't end there. Because that cup was still sitting on the table and someone else would drink from it. What happened inside that house? Who survived? Who didn't? And why did a woman who arrived with nothing but empty hands end up changing everything? Let's start this story from the very beginning. If this story touched your heart, hit like and share it so others can hear it too. And if you want to follow the stories that come next, subscribe to our channel so you never miss one. The story began in a house perched on the highest hill in New Haven, Connecticut. From the outside, it looked like the mansion of a successful businessman, with an iron fence wrapped around it, a broad garden stretching across the front, and an entrance paved with white gravel. But people in the circle, people who knew the truth, called that place by another name, the Donnelly House. And the man at the head of that house was Knox Donnelly, 33 years old, the master of an empire no one dared to name in public. That afternoon, Knox was sitting in his study. Across from him stood Walt, a 38-year-old man who had been Knox's right hand for the past 10 years. Walt was giving a report. A partner out west had just gone back on a deal, swallowing an entire real estate shipment worth millions of dollars, a deal both sides had agreed to with a handshake 3 months earlier. When Walt finished speaking, he stood there and waited. Knox didn't get angry. He didn't slam the desk, didn't curse, didn't rise from his chair. He simply sat still, turning a pen between 2 fingers, his eyes lowered to the surface of the desk. The room was so quiet that the ticking of the wall clock could be heard. Then Knox looked up and said exactly one sentence. "Cut off all their supply lines, starting this week." Walt nodded, turned, and walked out. He didn't ask again. He didn't need any further explanation. Once Knox had spoken, the matter was already finished. That was how Knox Donnelly ran everything. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to threaten anyone. His silence was already more frightening than anything another man could say. Knox stepped out of the study, walked down the wide hallway, and turned toward the second-floor balcony. There, a 62-year-old woman was sitting in a wicker chair, a book in her hand, her eyes fixed on the garden below. She was Margaret Donnelly, Knox's mother, the only woman in the world before whom Knox Donnelly had to lower his head. Knox stopped beside her. "Have you taken your medicine, Mother?" Margaret didn't look up, her eyes still glued to the page. "I'm not dead yet, so don't fuss over me." Knox didn't argue. He placed the pill and a glass of water on the small table beside his mother's chair, then turned and continued walking. He said nothing more. There was no need to say anything more. Every day was like that. Knox asked. Margaret scolded him. Knox set down the medicine, then left. That was the way the mother and son loved each other. Quietly, thornily, but more firmly than any sweet words could ever be. Margaret wasn't an ordinary woman. Her husband, the former boss of the Donnelly family, had died many years earlier. During the chaotic period when power passed into Knox's hands, she was the one who kept everything from collapsing. She was tough, sharp, and she had an eye for people that few could deceive. But lately, her health had begun to weaken. Her heart had problems, and the doctor had told her to take her medicine every day and avoid stress. Knox knew that, so he hid every business matter, every complication, every danger beyond the mansion doors. In front of his mother, Knox was only the son reminding her to take her medicine. Knox went down the stairs, and just as he turned into the first-floor hallway, a 45-year-old man stepped out from the direction of the kitchen and bowed his head in greeting. Perry Ashford, the butler of the Donnelly mansion. He had been here for 8 years, since the old boss was still alive. Perry bowed just deeply enough, his voice soft and respectful. "Sir, tomorrow's schedule has been arranged. In the morning, you have an appointment at 9 o'clock. In the afternoon, guests will arrive for dinner at 6 o'clock. I've prepared the dining room." Knox nodded, his eyes not looking at Perry, then kept walking. To Knox, Perry was part of the house, like the wall, like the door, like the clock on the wall, always there, always functioning, and never needing attention. Perry remained standing in the middle of the hallway, watching Knox's back disappear gradually at the end of the corridor. The smile on his face, the smile he had kept unchanged for the past 8 years, whenever he stood before the master of this house, slowly faded. The corners of his mouth lowered, his eyes changed. For one brief instant, when no one was watching, Perry Ashford's face became another face entirely. Then he turned, walked back toward the kitchen. And that smile returned, intact, flawless, as if it had never vanished at all. The house on the hill remained quiet that afternoon. Everything looked normal. Everyone looked normal. But inside that house, someone was counting down. And no one knew. Tessa Wright arrived at the Donnelly mansion on a Tuesday morning, her right hand carrying a canvas bag that held every possession she had in the world, her left hand holding the hand of a 4-year-old child named Bree. An acquaintance had recommended her for the position here, to take care of the lady of the house, a job with wages, and a place to live. Tessa didn't know who the Donnelly family was. She didn't know what kind of power was held by the man she had glimpsed walking past the hallway a moment earlier. She only knew one thing. This was the only place that would take her and her child in, and she needed this roof over their heads. Perry Ashford received Tessa at the front door. He led her through each area of the mansion, his footsteps slow, his voice even, and the way he spoke made Tessa understand at once that this man considered himself the second master of the house. Perry listed the rules as if he were reading the law. She wasn't allowed to go up to the second floor unless she was called. She wasn't allowed to look the boss directly in the eye. She wasn't allowed to ask about anything that had nothing to do with her work. She wasn't allowed to open any room door without permission. Tessa walked beside him, listening in silence, her hand still gripping Bree's tightly. When Perry finished speaking, he turned back to look at her with the smile he used for everyone, a smile so polite it looked false. "Do you understand?" Tessa looked at him, then she asked, her voice neither high nor low, calm as if she were asking about the weather. "Were those rules made by the lady of the house, or by you?" The smile on Perry's face disappeared, not slowly fading away the way it had when he watched Knox's back the day before, but vanishing instantly, as if someone had slapped him across the face with a question. He looked at Tessa, and in that gaze, something changed. He didn't answer. He simply turned and continued walking, and from that moment on, Perry Ashford disliked Tessa Wright. Margaret met Tessa in the first-floor sitting room. She was seated in a chair, the book still in her hand as always. Perry brought Tessa and Bree in, introduced them curtly, then stepped aside. Margaret put the book down and looked at Tessa. She didn't ask how old she was, where she came from, or what she had done before. She simply looked. She saw the woman's hands, calloused and rough, the hands of someone who had been doing hard work for a very long time. She saw the way Tessa kept the child close to her side, not with the ordinary instinct of protection, but with the instinct of someone afraid that someone might snatch away the only thing she had left. And she saw Tessa's eyes, tired, but not broken, not lowered, not begging. Margaret had lived long enough to know the difference between a weak person and a person who had endured too much. Tessa belonged to the second kind. Margaret nodded, speaking to Perry without looking at him. "She stays." Perry tilted his head slightly, but didn't object. He knew that once Margaret had decided, no one could change it, not even Knox. Bree stood behind her mother's legs, both hands clinging tightly to Tessa's pant leg, her eyes wide as she stared at the strange, enormous room. That 4-year-old child had never seen any room so large before. Margaret looked down and saw those round eyes secretly peeking up at her. She didn't smile, but her voice softened, gentler by far than the way she spoke to anyone else in this house. "I have a very beautiful garden out there. There are flowers and butterflies. Would you like to go see it?" Bree looked at her mother. Tessa gave a slight nod. Bree turned back to Margaret, hesitated for a moment, then slowly reached out her tiny hand and held the older woman's finger. Margaret stood, leading the child toward the glass door that looked out over the garden, her steps slowing to match Bree's short little strides. Tessa stood there watching them, and for the first time since she had stepped into this house, her shoulders lowered a little. Only a little. Perry led Tessa to the room, set aside for her and Bree, a small room at the end of the first-floor hallway, near Margaret's room. Perry opened the door, said, "This is your room," then left without another word. Tessa stepped inside and set the canvas bag down on the bed. Bree wasn't here yet. The little girl was still out in the garden with Margaret. The room was quiet. Tessa stood still for a moment, then did something she always did whenever she arrived at a new place to live. She walked to the door, reached out to touch the lock, and turned it to test it. It locked from the inside. She turned it again, checking once more. The lock was solid. She let go, drew a long breath, and began unpacking. That was Tessa's habit. Wherever she went, she checked the lock first. Not because she was afraid of thieves, but because there were things in her past that had taught her that a door that could be locked from the inside was the most precious thing a woman could have. A few weeks passed inside the Donnelly mansion, and Tessa began to get used to the rhythm of life in this house. Every morning, she woke before 6 o'clock, prepared Margaret's medicine and a glass of water, and placed them ready on the table beside her bed, then went down to the kitchen to make her a light breakfast. Porridge, fruit, 1 slice of toast, not too much, exactly as the doctor had instructed. Margaret never said thank you, but every morning she finished everything Tessa prepared. And to Tessa, that was already a way of saying thank you. Every afternoon, after Margaret finished her tea, or sometimes when she was busy with something else and didn't drink at all, Tessa cleared the tea table, and instead of pouring away what was left, she carried it out to the garden for Gus, the family gardener. Gus was always out in the garden, either holding pruning shears or turning the soil around the flower beds. Every time he saw Tessa carrying a cup of tea out to him, he would lift his head and smile, take it from her, and then the two of them would sit for a few minutes on the stone bench beside the flower bed and talk. They talked about ordinary things. The weather was beautiful today. The rose bushes were blooming late this year. Little Bree had run out into the garden yesterday, picked a flower, and laughed the whole afternoon. Gus was the only person in the mansion who spoke to Tessa as if he were speaking to an ordinary person, not a maid, not someone beneath him, just two human beings sitting together over afternoon tea. That habit repeated itself day after day, so normal that no one paid attention. Not even Tessa thought there was anything special about it. Meanwhile, Bree grew more and more attached to Margaret. The 4-year-old child, who at first had been timid and only dared to stand behind her mother's legs, now carried her box of crayons out and sat right on the floor beside Margaret's chair, drawing crooked little pictures and holding them up proudly to show her. Margaret looked at those pictures, the kind every child drew, all circles and curved lines with no clear shape, but she nodded and said, "Very beautiful," as if she were looking at a masterpiece. Bree began calling Margaret Nana. No one taught her to call her that. She did it on her own, naturally, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. And Margaret, the hard woman who had lived through so many storms, the woman the entire Donnelly family respected, found her heart softening at the sound of Nana from the mouth of a laughing 4-year-old child. One afternoon, Knox was walking down the first-floor hallway, his steps quick as always, on his way to the study. But he slowed, not because he saw something, because he heard something. From Tessa's room came the sound of very soft singing. It wasn't any particular song, only a gentle little melody, low and quiet, the kind of lullaby mothers hum when their children are about to fall asleep. Knox stopped in the middle of the hallway, stood still for a few seconds, then continued walking. He didn't look into the room, didn't open the door, didn't say anything. But that evening, as he sat at dinner with his mother, Knox asked, his voice calm as if he were asking about the weather, "Where did the new maid come from?" Margaret told him briefly. A young woman recommended by an acquaintance. A single mother. She had a small child, and no relatives in this area. Knox listened, nodded, and made no comment. Then mother and son continued eating in silence. But Margaret knew her son. For 33 years, she had watched him grow up, and she knew Knox Donnelly never asked a question without a reason. And while everything in the mansion seemed to be settling into a new rhythm, quieter and warmer than before, one person was watching it all with different eyes. Perry Ashford saw Margaret trusting Tessa more and more, giving her charge of the medicine schedule, allowing her into Margaret's private room to clean, even letting her sit beside her while she read in the afternoon. Every time Tessa entered Margaret's room, Perry stood in the hallway, his eyes following her. That look was no longer the contempt he had shown on the first day. It had changed into something else, wariness, because Perry knew that the more people came close to Margaret, the more eyes there would be looking into the things he had very carefully kept hidden all this time. And Tessa, the girl who had come here with nothing but empty hands, was moving closer every day to the very place Perry didn't want anyone to touch. It happened on a weeknight, when the entire mansion had sunk into silence. Knox was on the second floor, the light in his study still burning, though the door was closed tight. Walt was in the rear building reserved for the security team. Perry was in his room at the end of the hallway. Bree had been asleep since 8 o'clock at night, curled inside her blanket, her arms still wrapped around the stuffed bear Margaret had bought for her the week before, and Tessa lay on the bed beside her child, her eyes having only just closed for a few minutes. Margaret woke at 2 o'clock in the morning. Not because of any sound, but because her chest tightened, suddenly, as if someone had placed a stone on her rib cage and pressed down. She sat up sharply, both hands gripping the edge of the blanket. Her mouth parted as she tried to breathe, but the air seemed unwilling to enter her lungs. She gasped, each breath short, shallow, broken. The call bell was right there at the head of the bed. All she had to do was reach out and press it. But Margaret didn't press it. She was used to this. Nights like this weren't the first, and every time, she endured it alone, sitting still in the dark, waiting for the breathlessness to pass, then lying back down to sleep again. She didn't want to trouble anyone. She didn't want anyone to see her weak. All her life, she had lived as a strong woman, and she had no intention of changing that at 2 o'clock in the morning. But tonight, the breathlessness didn't pass as quickly as it usually did. It lingered. She sat on the bed, her back against the headboard, her chest rising and falling, her hands clenched so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She tried to draw a deep breath, but every breath seemed to be blocked halfway through. The sound of her breathing grew heavier, more urgent, carrying out of the room through the narrow gap in the door that hadn't been fully closed. Tessa heard it. She didn't know when she had first heard it, perhaps from the moment Margaret's breathing had begun to quicken, because Tessa was the kind of person who slept and still listened, the kind of person whose eyes would snap open at the smallest sound outside the door. She lay still for a few seconds, listening, then sat up. She looked at Bree, still sleeping deeply, gently pulled the blanket over her child, then stepped out of the room, barefoot on the cold wooden floor. Margaret's door was slightly open. Tessa pushed it gently and stepped inside. The room was dark, with only a little moonlight slipping through the curtains. Margaret was sitting on the bed, her back bent, both hands clutching her chest, breathing in short, broken pulls. She didn't see Tessa come in, or perhaps she did see her, but no longer had the strength to say anything. Tessa didn't ask, "Are you all right?" She knew the answer. She went straight to the head of the bed, opened the drawer, took out the bottle of medicine she prepared for Margaret every morning, poured one pill into her palm, then filled a glass with water from the pitcher already placed on the cabinet. She sat down on the edge of the bed, one hand supporting Margaret's back, the other offering the pill. "Take this." Her voice was soft, steady, not panicked. Margaret took the pill, put it in her mouth, and swallowed a sip of water. Her hand was trembling. Tessa didn't stand up. She stayed there, gently drawing Margaret against her shoulder, letting the older woman's head rest there, allowing her to breathe more easily with her chest lifted instead of folded forward. Margaret didn't resist. Perhaps because she no longer had the strength, or perhaps because in the dark, at 2 o'clock in the morning, when no one was watching, she allowed herself to be weak just once. The two of them sat still in the darkness. They said nothing. There was only the sound of Margaret's breathing slowly easing, becoming steadier, lighter. A minute passed, then another. Margaret took Tessa's hand and held it tightly, as if holding on to something she feared might slip away if she let go. Then she whispered, her voice thin as a strand of silk. "It's been a long time since anyone sat with me in the middle of the night like this." Tessa didn't look down. She didn't ask why, didn't ask who had once sat with her before, didn't ask whether she was lonely. She only clasped Margaret's hand in return, holding it a little tighter, then said softly, "I'm here. You don't have to be afraid." Margaret said nothing more. She closed her eyes, her head still resting on Tessa's shoulder, her breathing gradually evening out, slowly deepening, until her body grew heavier, and Tessa knew she had fallen asleep again. Tessa sat there a little longer, unmoving, afraid that the smallest motion might wake her. Then she gently laid Margaret back against the pillow, pulled the blanket up to her chest, and placed the medicine bottle and glass of water back exactly where they belonged on the bedside cabinet. She stood looking at Margaret for a few more seconds, then turned, walked out of the room, and closed the door softly behind her. On her way back to her own room, Tessa didn't cry. She only walked, barefoot, across the cold wooden floor, thinking that this house was such a strange place, so large, so wide, so many rooms, so many people, and yet in the middle of the night, an elderly woman sat alone, unable to breathe, with no one beside her. It happened one afternoon, about 3 weeks after the night Margaret had struggled to breathe. Everything in the mansion was peaceful. Margaret was sitting on the second floor reading. Bree was lying on her stomach on the floor beside her chair, drawing pictures. Tessa was in the first floor kitchen, preparing the evening meal. Knox was in his study. Then the noise began. First came the pounding. Again and again, hard, as if someone were using both hands to hammer against the iron gate. Then came the shouting. A man's voice, hoarse, slurred, roaring so loudly it carried across the garden, cut through the glass doors, and entered the house. "Tessa! Tessa! Open the door! I know you're in there. Bring my child out here." Tessa stood in the kitchen, the vegetable knife still in her hand, and she went completely still. Not because she didn't know whose voice it was, but because she knew it far too well. Dean Mercer, her former husband, the man she had run from with Bree in the middle of the night, changing her phone number, cutting off every contact, passing through 3 cities so she would never have to hear that voice again. But he had found her. Tessa set the knife down. Her hands were trembling, but her legs were not. She hurried up to the second floor, to Margaret's room. Bree was sitting there drawing, looking up at her mother, still unaware of anything because Margaret's room was set deep inside, its door closed. Tessa said quickly to Margaret, "Please keep Bree here with you." Margaret looked at Tessa's face and saw something in her eyes that she understood at once, without needing an explanation. She nodded, drew Bree closer, and said softly, "Stay here with me, sweetheart. Let's draw one more picture together." Bree happily picked up her colored pencils, knowing nothing, hearing nothing. Tessa turned, closed the door, then went down the stairs. She walked out toward the gate, alone. Dean Mercer stood outside the iron gate, swaying on his feet, his eyes red, clearly not sober. He was still pounding on the gate, still shouting, sweat running down his face. When he saw Tessa step out from inside, he stopped, then smiled, the crooked smile of a man who believed he still had the right. "See? I knew you were here. Bring my child out. She's my child." Tessa stood behind the iron gate. She didn't open it. She stood there, both arms hanging at her sides, looking straight into Dean's face. Her face was pale, but her eyes didn't dodge, didn't lower, didn't shake. She said, her voice steady, "You don't have any rights here anymore. I'm not the woman I used to be. Leave." Dean gave a mocking laugh. He stepped back, then lunged forward, both hands grabbing the iron bars, his feet beginning to kick around, searching for a place to climb. "You think these iron bars can stop me?" Then Dean stopped, because right behind Tessa, another man had appeared. There was no sound of footsteps, no sound of a door opening. He was simply there, as if he had been standing there for a long time. Knox Donnelly. He had seen everything through the security cameras from his study, and he had come down here, not because he panicked, but because he wanted to come down. Knox stood behind Tessa, half a head taller than she was, his eyes looking straight at Dean through the iron bars. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. His voice was slow, low, even, as if he were having an ordinary conversation. "You're standing in front of my house. You have 30 seconds. Dean looked at Knox. Then Dean looked to both sides, and his face changed. From the right, Walt stepped out, both arms crossed over his chest. From the left, another guard appeared, a man half again as large as Dean. Neither of them said anything. They simply stood there, but their presence was a language even a man who wasn't sober could still read. Dean let go of the iron bars and stepped back. Knox took one more step toward the gate. He stood close to the bars, his face less than a handspan from Dean's, and said even more slowly, "She and the child are under this roof. Under this roof, they belong to me. If you come back here again, you won't get the chance to walk away a third time." Dean looked into Knox's eyes, and in those eyes, He saw something he had never seen in anyone he had ever bullied. He saw absolute calm. Not calm because the man wasn't afraid. Calm because the man standing in front of him had faced things 100 times more frightening than him, and still stood there, still spoke slowly, still controlled everything. Dean stepped back. Then he turned around. Then he left. He didn't run, but he walked fast, and he didn't look back. From that day on, Dean Mercer never appeared at the Donnelly mansion again. That night, when the whole house had gone quiet, Tessa stood in the first-floor hallway, her back leaning against the wall, waiting. She knew Knox would pass this way on the path from the dining room back to his study, because every night he took this same route. And just as she expected, Knox came. He saw Tessa standing there and stopped. Tessa didn't say thank you. She didn't say anything. She only bowed her head, very deeply, for a very long time, in silence. Knox looked at her for a moment. Then he said, his voice still even, still cold, but with something changed inside it, something a little softer, only a little. "No one has the right to treat you and your child like that. No one." Then he continued on, his steps steady, his back straight, slowly disappearing at the end of the hallway. Tessa remained there alone, her back still against the wall. Then she cried. She cried without making a sound, tears running down both sides of her face, and she didn't lift a hand to wipe them away. She simply let them fall. This was the first time in so many years that Tessa Wright cried, not because she was hurt, not because she was afraid, but because for the first time in her life, someone had stood in front of her and said that no one was allowed to treat her badly. For the first time, someone had considered her worthy of protection. Perry Ashford wasn't a man who forgot easily. He remembered very clearly the day Tessa had asked him, "Were those rules made by the lady of the house, or by you?" He remembered the way Margaret had brushed him aside to protect the newly arrived girl. He remembered every time Tessa stepped into Margaret's room, every time Margaret handed her one more task that, before then, only he had been allowed to do. And he remembered very clearly that this girl was moving closer every day to the things he needed to keep hidden. Perry wasn't the kind of man who acted impulsively. He calculated. He waited. And when he decided to act, he did it cleanly, neatly, leaving no trace behind. One evening, while Tessa was bathing Bree before bedtime and Margaret had gone up to her room early to rest, Perry quietly stepped into Margaret's room. He knew exactly where her most precious bracelet was kept, in the second drawer of the wooden cabinet beside the bed, wrapped inside a piece of velvet cloth. He opened the drawer, took the bracelet out, slipped it into his coat pocket, then walked down the hallway to Tessa's room. The door wasn't locked, because Tessa was in the shared bathroom at the end of the hall with Bree. Perry opened the drawer of the small table beside Tessa's bed, placed the bracelet inside, and pushed the drawer shut again. The whole thing took less than 2 minutes. He returned to his own room, closed the door, and sat down to wait. The next morning, Perry knocked on Margaret's door with a worried expression on his face. "Madam, I cleaned your room this morning and realized your bracelet wasn't in the drawer. Did you put it somewhere else?" Margaret frowned, stood up, and opened the drawer herself to check. The bracelet wasn't there. She looked at Perry. Perry lowered his head, his voice pained, hesitant, as if what he was about to say was something he didn't want to say at all. "I don't want to believe it, but yesterday, I saw Miss Tessa leaving your room when you weren't here. I think perhaps we should check her room." Margaret said nothing. She followed Perry down the first-floor hallway to Tessa's room. Tessa was inside, folding Bree's clothes. Seeing Margaret and Perry standing at the door, she was surprised, but she stepped aside and let them in. Perry walked to the table beside the bed and pulled the drawer open. The bracelet lay there, on the bare wooden surface, not hidden, not covered, as if someone had deliberately placed it in the easiest spot to find. Tessa looked at the bracelet. Her face went white. She looked at Perry, then at Margaret. "I didn't take it." Her voice didn't tremble, but it was lower than usual. "I don't know how it got here." Perry stood beside them, his face perfectly fitted to the role he had prepared. Heartbroken, disappointed, like a loyal butler who had just discovered something he never wished to discover. He sighed, shook his head, and said nothing more. He let the silence finish the rest. Margaret stood in the middle of the room. She looked at the bracelet, then she looked at Tessa, then she looked at Perry. The room stayed silent for a very long time. Perry waited. He waited for Margaret to become angry, waited for her to throw Tessa out, waited for this girl to disappear from the house with her 4-year-old child, leaving with empty hands exactly as she had arrived. But that didn't happen. Margaret turned to Perry, her voice slow and clear, each word heavy as stone. "I've lived long enough to know when someone is telling the truth. This girl is telling the truth." She stepped forward, picked up the bracelet, fastened it back around her wrist, then turned and walked out of the room. She didn't look back, didn't explain, didn't ask another question. Perry remained in Tessa's room, alone with her. His face went rigid. He looked at Tessa, and Tessa looked back at him. In that moment, neither of them said anything, but both of them understood. Perry understood that Margaret had chosen a side, and Tessa understood that the man standing before her didn't simply dislike her. He was dangerous. From that day on, Tessa began paying attention to Perry, not deliberately following him, not pretending to be a detective, but by instinct. The same instinct that made her check the lock whenever she arrived at a new place to live. The same instinct that had made her hear Margaret's labored breathing in the middle of the night. She began noticing small things she had ignored before. Where Perry went in the evenings, whom Perry spoke to on the phone in the garden when he thought no one could hear, how Perry locked his own room more carefully than anyone else in the house. And then, one afternoon, while Tessa was cleaning the workroom at the back of the house, where Perry usually sat to handle expense papers, she saw a small brown-covered notebook lying on the desk. Perry had forgotten to put it away. The notebook was slightly open to one page, and Tessa saw rows of numbers written inside in red ink. She didn't open it to look. She didn't understand what those numbers meant, but she remembered, because Tessa Wright was the kind of person who remembered unusual things, even when she didn't yet know what they would mean. But Perry Ashford wasn't merely a greedy butler who wanted to steal a little money and run. His story was more complicated than that. Over the past 1 or 2 years, ever since Margaret's health had begun to weaken and she gradually let go of some control over the household expense books, Perry had started withdrawing money from the mansion's living fund. At first, they were small amounts, easy to hide, easy to erase. Then the small amounts became larger amounts, and Perry thought no one knew. But he was wrong. Someone did know. Not Margaret, not Knox, but Ronan Voss, the boss at the head of another underground empire in the Northeast, a man who had wanted to swallow the Donnelly family's territory for a very long time, but had never found an opening. Ronan's men had been watching the Donnelly mansion for many months, and they discovered that Perry often went out alone at unusual hours. They dug deeper, followed the trail of expenses, and realized Perry was embezzling. That was all Ronan needed. One evening, while Perry was outside the mansion, a strange man approached him. The man didn't waste words. He said it directly. "We know what you're doing with the Donnelly household fund. You have 2 choices. 1, we send the evidence to Knox Donnelly and let him deal with you in his own way. 2, you cooperate with us, and when everything is done, you'll have enough money to live the rest of your life anywhere in the world, along with a new passport under someone else's name." Perry didn't have a real choice. He knew that if Knox discovered he had been embezzling, he would never walk out of New Haven on his own 2 feet, so he nodded. And from then on, he began handing over everything Ronan needed. The layout of the mansion's security system, the camera passwords, the entry and exit schedules of Knox and the bodyguard team, the list of everyone living in the house, their names, their roles, their habits, including Tessa and Bree. Perry handed it all over, holding nothing back, because he believed this was his ticket out. But there was one thing Perry didn't know. In Ronan Voss's eyes, he was only a chess piece, a useful puppet, used, then discarded. Ronan had no intention of keeping his promise to a butler who had betrayed his master. When everything was over, Perry would be left behind, alone, with no money, no passport, and no way out. But Perry couldn't see that, because greed and fear had blinded him long ago. Now, Perry's plan was no longer as simple as taking the money and running. It had grown larger. He would bring Margaret down, the only person who could check the books and discover everything. He would destroy the camera system in the middle of the chaos, to erase his traces and make it easier for Ronan's men to approach the mansion if necessary. Then he would disappear. The plan was ready. He only needed to wait for the right moment. The moment Perry had been waiting for came sooner than he expected. One morning, Margaret was sitting on the balcony drinking tea as usual, holding the morning newspaper Perry placed on the table for her every day. She turned to the business page, and her eyes stopped. A large article, half a page long, reported that a real estate deal worth tens of millions of dollars had just been completed in the Northeast, backed by a corporation named Donnelly Holdings. Margaret didn't need anyone to explain. She set the newspaper down, picked up the phone, and called Knox. Knox answered after 2 rings. "Mother, I just read the paper," Margaret said, her voice neither pleased nor displeased, only the voice of a mother long used to her son doing enormous things without ever telling her. "A very big deal." "Yes," Knox replied, one single word, his voice calm as if they were speaking about the weather. "Why didn't you tell me?" "It wasn't finished yet, so I didn't say anything." "It's finished now." "Yes, it's finished." Margaret was silent for a few seconds, then said, "Your father would be very proud." Then she hung up. Knox held the phone for a few more seconds before setting it down. The call had lasted less than a minute, but that was how the Donnelly mother and son celebrated. No parties, no champagne, no embracing each other with laughter. Only a short phone call and 1 sentence mentioning the dead. Perry learned the news another way. He didn't read the newspaper, didn't hear the call, but he was the butler, the one who arranged the schedule for the entire house. And over the past 2 weeks, Knox's schedule had changed noticeably. Meetings with the bank had doubled. Lawyers came to the mansion 3 times in 1 week. Walt went out more often than usual. And one evening, Perry heard Knox say 2 words to Walt over the phone. "It's signed." Perry didn't need anyone to say it outright. He pieced the fragments together himself and understood that a very large sum of money was about to pour into the Donnelly family's financial system. And the safe inside the mansion, the safe whose password he had memorized long ago, would no longer be empty. That night, Perry sat in his room, the door locked, the lights off. He sat on the edge of the bed, his fingers interlaced, his head lowered. He had finished calculating everything long ago: the safe, the camera system password, the dosage of the substance he had bought and hidden in a shoebox at the bottom of the closet. The day Knox would be away with the main bodyguard team. Everything was ready. He only needed to wait for the right day, tomorrow, or the day after, or any day Knox stepped out through the gate with Walt. He clenched both hands, then released them, then clenched them again. That night, Perry Ashford couldn't sleep. Not because he was afraid, but because he was counting down. At the same time, not far from Perry's room, the light was still on in Knox's study. Knox sat behind his desk, the desk lamp casting a golden glow over 1/2 of his face, while the other half sank into shadow. On the desk sat a glass of liquor, freshly poured, untouched. Knox sat still, not looking at the documents, not looking at the screen, only sitting there alone, in the wide room, inside the great house, in the kind of silence only people standing at the very top could understand. He had just completed the deal he had pursued for years. Many people would have celebrated. Knox sat here alone, pouring a glass of liquor he didn't even bother to drink. A soft knock came at the door. Knox looked up. Tessa stood at the threshold, her hand still resting on the door she had just knocked on. "I saw the light was still on. Do you need me to make tea or get you anything, sir?" Knox looked at her. She was wearing simple sleep clothes, her hair tied neatly back, slippers on her feet, clearly on her way to check Margaret's room as she did every night when she saw the light in this room still burning. Knox shook his head. "No, go rest." Tessa nodded and was about to turn away. Then she stopped. She knew she shouldn't say anything more. She knew her place in this house. But perhaps because the night was too quiet, perhaps because she saw something on the face of the man sitting in the study, something she had never seen there before. Knox's eyes weren't as cold as usual. His eyes were tired, the kind of tiredness that belonged to a man who had won, but didn't know what he had won for. Tessa spoke softly, as if she were asking herself more than asking him. "You just won a major deal, and you're sitting here alone. Don't you have anyone to share the joy with?" The question fell into the room like a pebble dropping into a still lake. Knox looked at Tessa. He didn't answer, not because he was angry, nor because the question was wrong, but because it was the truest question anyone could have asked him at that moment, and Knox Donnelly wasn't used to anyone asking the right thing. Tessa realized she had gone too far. She lowered her head slightly, murmured, "I'm sorry, sir," then turned and walked away, her slippers making a faint sound against the hallway floor. Knox remained seated in the room, watching until her shadow disappeared around the corner of the corridor. Then he looked down at the glass of liquor on the desk. Then he looked back at the place where she had just stood. Around Knox Donnelly, there were hundreds of people, subordinates, partners, lawyers, bodyguards. But none of them dared ask him such an ordinary question. None of them dared look at him and see what Tessa had just seen, because all of them either feared him or needed him, or both. But Tessa didn't fear him, and she didn't need him. She had simply walked past, seen the light on, and asked. That night, inside the Donnelly mansion, 3 people were awake. Perry was awake because he was counting down to the day he would betray them. Knox was awake because, for the first time, someone had seen his loneliness. And Tessa was awake because she lay on her bed, staring up at the ceiling, wondering why she had said those words, and wondering why, when she looked into the eyes of the most powerful man in the city, what she saw wasn't strength, but the exhaustion of a person carrying too much with no one beside him to help bear the weight. That day came on a Thursday morning. Knox received a call from Walt at 7 o'clock, an urgent matter that needed to be handled in person in the suburbs, involving the new real estate shipment. Knox put on a suit, went downstairs, gave Margaret a few short instructions, then stepped out the door. Walt was already waiting outside by the car with 2 bodyguards. The car left the mansion at 7:30. Perry stood at the front door, bowing his head to see his master off, his polite smile the same as every morning. But when the car disappeared around the last curve of the hill road, Perry straightened his back, and that smile vanished. He looked at his watch. He had waited a very long time for this day. The mansion still had 2 guards stationed at the gate, but they only watched the outside and didn't come into the house. Inside the mansion at that moment, there was only Margaret on the 2nd floor, Tessa cleaning the 1st floor kitchen, Bree playing in the room, Gus out in the garden watering the plants as he did every morning, and Perry. Perry entered the kitchen. He boiled water, took out the teapot, put in the tea leaves, poured in the boiling water, following the same process he had used every afternoon to make tea for Margaret for the past 8 years. His hands didn't tremble. He had practiced this motion in his mind hundreds of times. Once the tea had steeped, he opened the teapot lid, took a small packet from his coat pocket, and poured what was inside into the pot. He stirred it evenly, slowly, gently, as if he were stirring in sugar. Then he poured the tea into a cup, placed the cup on a silver tray with a small plate of pastries, covered it with a white cloth. Everything neat, lovely, perfect. He carried the tray up to the 2nd floor and knocked on the sitting room door, where Margaret was reading. "Your afternoon tea, madam." His voice was gentle, the same voice he had used for 8 years. He set the tray on the table, bowed his head, then withdrew. He walked down the hallway, turned toward his room, closed the door behind him, and began packing his suitcase. Margaret set her book down and looked at the steaming cup of tea on the tray. She reached for it, lifting the cup, the familiar scent of tea rising warm and faintly bitter, exactly the kind she drank every afternoon. The cup came close to her lips. At that very moment, the sitting room door burst open. Bree ran in, her hair loose, her face flushed because she had just run up from the stairs, both hands waving, her little mouth calling loudly, "Nana, Nana, there are beautiful butterflies in the garden, so many of them. Come see them with me." The 4-year-old child ran straight to Margaret, held both of her hands, and tugged at her. "Come on, Nana, the butterflies will all fly away." Margaret looked at Bree, at those round eyes shining with excitement, at the tiny hands clutching hers so tightly, and she smiled. She set the teacup back on the table without having taken a single sip. All right, let's go see the butterflies." She stood, letting Bree lead her by the hand, and the grandmother and child went out to the balcony, then down into the garden. Bree's laughter rang through the garden, followed by Margaret's fond scolding. "Slow down. I can't keep up with you." And then the sound of the 2 of them gradually faded away. The teacup remained on the table, alone. The steam thinned little by little, then disappeared. The tea grew cold. No one remembered it. About half an hour later, Tessa went up to the 2nd floor to clean the sitting room. She saw the tea tray still on the table. Margaret's cup was still full, untouched. Tessa looked out the window and saw Margaret and Bree in the garden. Margaret seated on the stone bench while Bree ran around the flower bed chasing butterflies. Tessa understood that Margaret had gone out into the garden before she had a chance to drink. This happened from time to time. When Bree dragged her out to play, Margaret forgot everything. Tessa carried the tray down to the kitchen, washed the pastry plate, then looked at the cup of tea. The tea was still untouched, and as she did every day, Following the habit she had kept for the past several weeks, she carried the cup of tea out toward the garden, to Gus. Gus was sitting on the stone bench beside the rose bed, pruning shears in his hand, beads of sweat on his forehead. When he saw Tessa carrying the teacup out, he looked up and gave his familiar smile. "Miss Tessa, bringing tea to this old man again?" Tessa smiled and handed him the cup. The lady of the house went out to the garden to play with Bree and forgot to drink it. "It's cold now, but it's still good." Gus accepted it, thanked her, and drank. He drank slowly, looking at the rose bushes he had just finished trimming, while telling Tessa about the sparrows that had flown into the garden that morning to build a nest in the eastern oak tree. Tessa sat beside him, listened, smiled, then stood and said she had to go back inside to finish cleaning. Gus waved, drank the last sip in the cup, then returned to his work. The cup of tea had changed hands, from the person it had been brewed to bring down, into the hands of someone no one had thought of. And not a single person inside the Donnelly mansion, not Tessa, not Margaret, not Gus, not even Perry packing his suitcase in his room, knew that what lay inside that cup was not only tea. A few hours later, Tessa was in the first-floor kitchen washing dishes when she heard a sound from the garden. It wasn't loud, only the crack of a breaking branch, then the heavy drag of footsteps over gravel, then someone calling out, weakly, almost without a voice. Tessa stopped what she was doing and listened. Then she heard it more clearly. A familiar voice, Gus's voice, but completely different from the way he usually sounded. That voice was trembling, broken, like a man trying to speak without enough breath to carry the words. Tessa ran out. She saw Gus in the middle of the garden path, about 10 steps from the back door. He was trying to make his way toward the house, but his legs no longer obeyed him. One hand clung to the trunk of a tree, the other pressed against his stomach, his face gray and pale, cold sweat soaking his forehead. When he saw Tessa running toward him, he tried to open his mouth, his voice so thin that a stronger gust of wind might have swallowed it whole. "Miss Tessa, I don't feel well." Then his knees gave out. Tessa lunged forward just in time to catch him before his head struck the gravel path. She laid him on his side, one hand supporting his head, the other lightly patting his cheek. "Gus! Gus! Look at me!" Gus opened his eyes, but they were dull and unfocused. Tessa turned her head and shouted toward the gate. "Is anyone there? Call an ambulance. Hurry!" The 2 guards outside the gate heard her voice and ran in. One called emergency services, while the other rushed into the garden to help Tessa lift Gus. Margaret heard the commotion from upstairs and came down. When she saw Gus lying on the path, his face drained of all color, with Tessa kneeling beside him, Margaret didn't panic. She had lived long enough to know panic didn't help anything. She took out her phone and called Knox. Knox was sitting in the middle of negotiations with 3 partners in a private restaurant downtown. Walt sat beside him, and 2 bodyguards stood outside the door. Knox's phone rang. He looked at the screen and saw his mother's name. Margaret almost never called him in the middle of the day unless something had happened. Knox answered and listened. She spoke briefly. Gus had collapsed in the garden. An ambulance had been called, and his condition wasn't good. After Knox heard her, he closed the phone and set it on the table. He stood up, in the middle of the sentence being spoken by the partner across from him, in the middle of the contract lying open on the table. Knox Donnelly rose and walked out. The partner looked up. "Mr. Donnelly, what's going on?" Knox didn't answer. He didn't look back. He only glanced at Walt, and Walt stood up after him without needing to ask. The 2 of them walked out the door, got into the car, and left. The 3 partners remained seated in the room, looking at one another, and no one dared call after him. The ambulance reached the mansion in 15 minutes. Gus was placed on a stretcher, and Tessa went with him. Margaret stayed behind to watch Bree. Bree knew nothing about what had happened. She was taking her afternoon nap on the 2nd floor. At the hospital, the doctors took Gus in and ran urgent tests. Tessa sat in the hallway waiting, both hands resting on her lap, her eyes lowered to the floor. She thought. She thought about that afternoon, about the cup of tea she had carried out to Gus, about the tea tray on the sitting room table. Then she thought about Perry, the man who had made that cup of tea. The doctor came out to speak with Tessa after more than an hour. He said, his voice serious but careful, "We found a foreign substance in his blood. We need further testing to determine exactly what it is, but the initial signs suggest this isn't a natural illness. Did he eat or drink anything unusual today?" Tessa heard that sentence, and her stomach tightened. "This afternoon, he only drank the cup of tea I brought him," she said softly, her voice steady, though her hands were clenched tightly together. "That tea was made by Perry for Margaret. She didn't drink it, so I brought it out to Gus." The doctor looked at her, said nothing more, and turned back inside. Tessa remained seated alone on the plastic bench outside the hospital corridor, and everything began falling into place in her mind. That cup of tea hadn't been made for Gus. That cup of tea had been made for Margaret, and the person who made it was Perry. Knox arrived at the hospital 20 minutes later. He stepped into the hallway, with Walt behind him. Tessa stood when she saw him. Knox looked at her and asked, "How is he?" Tessa told him. She told him about the cup of tea, about Perry making tea for Margaret, about Margaret not drinking it because Bree had pulled her out to the garden, about Tessa bringing the tea to Gus, as she did every day, and about what the doctor had just said. She told it briefly, without a wasted word, because Tessa wasn't someone who talked too much, and because she knew the man standing in front of her wasn't someone who needed to hear too much. Knox listened. His face changed, not in an ordinary way. He didn't frown, didn't grit his teeth, didn't clench his fists. His face went cold. Walt stood beside him, and in the 10 years he had followed Knox, Walt had seen that face no more than 3 times. It was Knox's face when he had passed beyond anger, beyond even fear, into a place on the other side where he was completely still and completely dangerous. Knox turned to Walt and said 4 words. "Close the mansion gates." Then 4 more. "No one gets out." Knox drove back to the mansion. Walt sat in the passenger seat, phone pressed to his ear, calling the guards at the gate to confirm that the order to close the gates had been carried out. No one out, no one in. Knox didn't say a single word the entire way back. When the car stopped in front of the mansion gate, he stepped out, walking fast, shoulders straight, eyes fixed ahead. He didn't go into the sitting room. He went straight down to the first-floor kitchen. The teapot was still on the counter, exactly where Perry had left it that afternoon. Tessa had cleared the cup and tray, but she had left the teapot because she hadn't had time to wash it before Gus collapsed. Knox looked at the teapot, then he turned to Walt. "Call him down here." Margaret had returned from the hospital before Knox. She was sitting in the sitting room right beside the kitchen, the door open, able to hear everything. Her face showed no expression, but her hand was gripping the arm of the chair tightly. Tessa was upstairs, taking Bree into the room, laying the little girl on the bed, turning on a cartoon on the tablet, and saying, "You watch your movie here, sweetheart. Mommy's going downstairs to clean the kitchen. Then I'll come back up." Bree nodded, her eyes fixed happily on the screen. Tessa closed the bedroom door, then went down the stairs. She didn't have to go. No one told her she had to be there, but she knew Perry would blame her, because she was the last person who had touched that cup of tea, and she didn't run from things she hadn't done. Perry stepped down into the kitchen, still wearing his normal expression, but his eyes flicked quickly across the room, seeing Knox standing beside the counter and Walt standing near the doorway. He didn't yet know about Gus. In his mind, the plan was still moving. He only needed to wait a few more hours, wait until night fell, then take the money from the safe and disappear. "You called for me, sir?" His voice was respectful as always. Knox didn't look at him. He looked at the teapot. Then he said, his voice even and slow, "Pour a cup. Drink it in front of me." Perry stood still. His eyes blinked. "Sir, I don't understand." Knox lifted his eyes and looked straight into Perry's face, and under the kitchen lights. His eyes were so cold that Perry stepped back half a step without realizing he was doing it. "Gus is lying in the hospital," Knox said. "What he drank this afternoon was tea from this teapot. The teapot you prepared." And Perry understood. For one brief moment, his face changed, only a flicker, like a failing light, but Knox saw it. Fear. Then Perry regained his composure, or tried to. He began to act. He denied it. "Gus? Good heavens, how could that happen? I made tea for the lady of the house, the same tea she drinks every day. I didn't." He shook his head, his voice trembling, his eyes wide. Then he dropped to his knees, both hands clasped in front of his chest, tears beginning to fall. "Madam," he called to Margaret, turning toward the sitting room. "You know me. I've been in this house for 8 years. I've been loyal to you. I would never." His voice broke, his shoulders shook. He acted well. He had acted well for 8 years. Then he changed direction. He stood up, wiped his eyes, looked at Knox. and his voice shifted from pleading to accusation. "Ask who was the last person to touch that cup of tea, Miss Tessa. She hasn't been here long at all. She was the one who cleared the tea table. She was the one who carried the tea outside. What do you know about her? Where did she come from? Has anyone checked her?" A voice cut across him, from the direction of the stairs. Tessa stepped into the kitchen. She didn't shout. She didn't tremble. She stood in the kitchen doorway, looked straight into Perry's face, and said, her voice even and clear, each word distinct, "I've made tea for her every day for weeks. If I wanted to hurt her, I would have had hundreds of chances. But I'm not you." Perry looked at her, his mouth opening before he could speak. But Tessa had already turned to Knox. There's a small brown-covered notebook in his room. Inside it are rows of numbers written in red ink. I saw it while cleaning. You should have someone go get it. Knox looked at Tessa. 1 second. Then he nodded to Walt. Walt turned and walked quickly out of the kitchen, up the stairs. The kitchen fell silent. Perry stood in the middle of the room, his eyes beginning to dart, looking at Knox, looking at Tessa, looking at the door, looking at the window. He was calculating. He was searching for a way out. Walt returned in less than 3 minutes, holding the small brown-covered notebook. Walt opened it, flipped through a few pages, then handed it to Knox. Knox looked. Inside, written clearly in red ink, line after line, were the safe password, the security system code, the camera password, account numbers, all in Perry's handwriting. Perry looked at the notebook in Knox's hand. His face collapsed. It was over. Everything was over. There was nothing left to act out, nothing left to deny. And in that moment of desperation, Perry did the only thing he could still think to do. He shoved the kitchen table aside, turned, and lunged toward the back door. Walt blocked the door at once. Perry slammed into Walt's chest, trying to push through, but Walt stood still like a wall. Perry fought and struggled. Knox stepped up from behind, grabbed Perry by the shoulder with one hand, yanked him backward, and forced him down onto the kitchen floor. Knox held him there, one knee pinning his back, one hand pressing down on his shoulder, and said close to Perry's ear, his voice so low only the two of them could hear it. 8 years. You ate at this house for 8 years, and you were going to bring down my mother. Perry lay on the kitchen floor, his face pressed against the cold tile, with no strength left to resist. And then he began to talk. Not acting anymore. This time, he told the truth. He confessed everything. Embezzling from the household expense fund for nearly 2 years. Buying that substance from an outside source. Hiding it in a shoebox at the bottom of the closet. The plan to take money from the safe, destroy the cameras, and disappear. And the final name he spoke, the name that made Knox tighten his grip on Perry's shoulder another degree, was Ronan Voss. Perry was still lying on the kitchen floor when the sound of footsteps came from the sitting room. Slow, steady, one step at a time. Margaret entered the kitchen. Knox looked up at his mother, about to say something, but Margaret raised her hand to signal him to be quiet. She didn't look at Knox. She didn't look at Walt. She didn't look at Tessa, who was standing still beside the doorway. She looked only at Perry. Walt understood what she meant, loosened his hold enough for Perry to sit up, but still kept him on the floor. Perry sat there, his back against the kitchen cabinet, his hands hanging loose, his face stained with tears and dust from the tile floor, looking up at Margaret as she stood before him. Margaret looked down at Perry. She looked for a long time. She didn't speak. The kitchen was so quiet that the clock on the wall could be heard, along with the soft wind outside the window. Then she spoke. Her voice was calm, slow, but beneath every word ran a thin tremor, like a cord stretched to its final limit before it snapped. I considered you family. 8 years ago, you came here with nothing. I gave you a room to live in. I gave you work. I gave you trust. I trusted you more than an outsider. She stopped, drew a breath, and her voice grew heavier, slower, as if every next word cost more strength than the one before. And this is how you repaid me. She said nothing more. She didn't ask why, didn't demand an explanation, didn't scold him. She turned her back and walked out of the kitchen, her spine straight, her head not lowered, her steps still as even as when she had walked in. She didn't look back. The sitting room door closed behind her, and behind that door, no one knew what Margaret Donnelly was doing, what she was thinking, what she was feeling. But everyone in the kitchen knew that the words she had just spoken were the heaviest words one person could say to a traitor. No need to shout, no need to curse, only the truth, spoken in the voice of someone who had trusted completely and then been betrayed completely. Perry sat on the floor, staring at the door Margaret had just passed through, and he cried. This time, he wasn't acting. There was no audience to convince, no role to play, no one left to deceive. He cried because he had just seen the thing he had tried not to see for 8 years. Margaret had truly considered him family, and he had destroyed that with his own hands. Knox watched his mother leave, his jaw tight, the muscle at his temple twitching slightly. He turned back to Perry, his voice cold, carrying no emotion except the truth. My mother wants to hand you over to the police. If it were up to me, you wouldn't get the chance to reach the station. Then he turned to Walt. Call the police. The police arrived at the Donnelly mansion 20 minutes later. 2 officers stepped inside, listened as Knox gave a brief explanation, then looked at Perry sitting on the kitchen floor. Perry didn't resist. He let the 2 officers pull him to his feet, cuff him, and lead him toward the door. As he passed through the hallway, Perry looked toward the staircase leading to the 2nd floor, where Margaret's room was, where Bree was watching cartoons without knowing anything. Then he lowered his head, stepped outside, and got into the police car. The car door closed. Walt didn't wait long. He went up to Perry's room as soon as the police left. The door wasn't locked. Inside, the suitcase lay on the bed, already neatly packed, clothes folded squarely, a passport tucked into the outside pocket. The brown-covered notebook had already been taken by Knox, but Walt found another small piece of paper folded into quarters and stuffed inside a shoe lining, with additional backup passwords written on it. And in the shoebox at the bottom of the wardrobe, exactly as Perry had confessed, there was a small bottle, the cap screwed on tightly, holding what remained of the substance he hadn't used up. Walt carried everything downstairs and placed it on the table in front of Knox. Knox looked. The suitcase, the notebook, the small bottle. The entire dark life of Perry Ashford lay neatly on one tabletop. Knox called for stronger security at the mansion that very night. More men at the gate, more cameras, every system password changed. But Knox knew this wasn't over yet, because in everything Perry had confessed on the kitchen floor, there was one name Knox couldn't ignore. Ronan Voss, the man behind it, the man who had turned a butler into a puppet. And that man was still out there. News of Perry's arrest reached Ronan Voss in less than a day. Ronan wasn't the kind of man who accepted failure easily. He had invested time, money, and an entire intelligence network to plant an insider inside the Donnelly mansion. And now that piece had been overturned. Perry was in police custody, and Ronan knew that sooner or later, the man would give up his name. Ronan needed to move quickly. Not to save Perry, because he didn't care about Perry, but to put pressure on Knox. To force Knox to divide his attention across several fronts at once, to create an opening. And among all the information Perry had provided before he was arrested, there was one detail Ronan remembered very clearly. Margaret Donnelly was being cared for by a young woman named Tessa Wright, a single mother with a 4-year-old child. Ronan didn't know what Tessa was to Knox beyond the relationship between master and servant. He only knew she cared for Knox's mother, and Margaret was Knox Donnelly's only weakness. Take away the person who cared for his mother, and he would have to come back. That morning, Tessa asked Margaret for permission to go out and buy medicine. Margaret's heart medication was almost gone, and more had to be bought before the weekend. Bree stayed at the mansion with Margaret, the grandmother and child sitting together on the 2nd floor, looking through picture books. Tessa walked to the pharmacy about 15 minutes from the mansion, bought the medicine, put it in her bag, then walked home. She followed the familiar road, the road she had taken many times before, quiet, lined with trees on both sides. She didn't notice the dark van parked beside the road. She walked past it. The van door opened. 2 men stepped out, quickly, one blocking her from the front, the other circling behind her. Tessa reacted at once. She stepped back, dodged to the side, and tried to run. But the man behind her caught her arm and yanked her backward. Tessa fought. She kicked. She scratched. She struggled with every bit of strength she had. But the 2 men were twice her size, and the road was empty. They shoved her into the back seat, covered her eyes, slammed the door, and the van drove away. From the moment Tessa stepped out of the mansion to the moment she disappeared, less than 30 minutes had passed. At the mansion, Margaret called Tessa after 1 hour. No one answered. She called a second time. A third time. Still nothing. Margaret knew Tessa wasn't someone who missed calls. She always kept her phone with her, afraid Margaret might need to call if she had trouble breathing. Margaret picked up the phone and called Knox. Knox was in his study, holding a glass of water, listening to Walt report on the strengthened security. His phone rang. His mother's voice came through. "Tessa went out to buy medicine this morning, and I can't reach her." Knox listened, and his hand tightened around the glass, tighter, then tighter still, until there was a small crack, and the glass split in his grip, water spilling between his fingers. He set the glass down on the desk and stood. "Find her," he said to Walt, "at any cost." Knox mobilized his entire network. Traffic cameras were accessed. City contacts were activated. Knox's men searched every corner. Within 3 hours, they identified the van, tracked its route, and found its destination, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts, about a 40-minute drive from New Haven. Knox got into the car. Walt drove. 2 bodyguards followed. Knox didn't assign this to anyone else. He went himself. Inside the warehouse, Tessa sat on an iron chair, her hands tied behind her back with rope. 2 men stood in front of her, one sitting on a table and swinging his legs, the other pacing back and forth. They had questioned her many times, asked about the safe inside the mansion, asked about the security system, asked about Knox's schedule. Each time they asked, Tessa didn't answer, and the man pacing back and forth would slam his hand down on the table, shout in her face, threaten her. Tessa clenched her teeth and stayed silent. Her wrists were red because she hadn't stopped twisting, pulling, trying to free herself from the rope since the moment they tied her up. The rope scraped against her skin, burning, but she didn't stop. The man sitting on the table jumped down, walked over, and bent close to her face. "Last time. Where's the safe? What's the password?" Tessa lifted her head and looked straight into his face. There was a mark on her face from when they had shoved her into the van, and her eyes were slightly swollen, but her gaze didn't waver. "I'm only a maid. I don't know anything. And even if I did, I wouldn't tell someone like you." The man looked at her and saw something in her eyes he hadn't expected to find in a woman tied to a chair in the middle of an abandoned warehouse. Absolute refusal, not because she was brave, but because she had faced things far more frightening than him before, and she had survived, and she was still here, still looking straight ahead. Then the warehouse door opened. It didn't open gently. It burst wide, and afternoon light flooded in. Knox stepped across the threshold. Walt was right behind him. 2 bodyguards spread out to both sides. Everything happened fast. The 2 men in the warehouse didn't have time to react before Walt and the bodyguards rushed in, forced them down onto the floor, and restrained them. Knox didn't look at them. He walked straight to Tessa. He looked at her, at the red marks on her wrists from the rope, at the bruise on her face. But her eyes were still open, still looking straight ahead, still unbroken. Knox said nothing. He pulled a small knife from his coat pocket and cut through the rope. Tessa brought her hands forward, her wrists red, the rope marks cut deep into her skin. Knox took off his coat and placed it over her shoulders, pulling the sleeves longer, just enough to cover both of her wrists. He didn't say, "Are you all right?" He didn't need to ask, because one look at her told him she wasn't all right, but she would never admit it. Tessa sat still for a moment, both hands drawn inside the coat, her shoulders trembling slightly. Then she opened her mouth, and the first thing she said wasn't "thank you," wasn't "I was so scared," wasn't anything about herself. "Where's Bree? Is my child all right?" Knox looked at her. "She's safe. My mother is holding her." Tessa heard that, and all the strength she had been holding for hours, the strength that had kept her from talking, from collapsing, from begging, suddenly dissolved. She closed her eyes, drew one very long, very deep, very slow breath. Tears slipped from the corners of her closed eyes, silent, soundless, and her hand, the hand with the wrist reddened by rope, closed tightly around Knox's hand. She held on the way Margaret had held on to her hand that night in the dark, when she couldn't breathe. Knox didn't pull away. He let her hold him, standing there in silence, until Tessa was ready to stand. The car drove back toward the mansion. Walt was behind the wheel, his eyes fixed straight ahead, saying nothing. The 2 bodyguards followed in a separate car behind them, together with Ronan's 2 men, who had been restrained and tied up. In the back seat, Knox sat on the left, and Tessa sat on the right. The distance between them was only a handspan, but neither of them touched the other, and neither of them said a word. Tessa pulled Knox's coat tighter around herself, the long sleeves covering her wrists, hiding the red rope marks underneath. She closed her eyes, rested her head against the seat, and remained still like that for the entire 40-minute drive. She wasn't sleeping. Knox knew she wasn't sleeping, because every now and then, he saw her lips press together, then loosen, then press together again, like someone trying to keep something from slipping out, but he didn't ask. He only sat there, in the same silence, in the same car, and for Knox Donnelly, a man used to giving orders with words, sitting silently beside someone was perhaps the closest thing to tenderness he knew how to offer. The car stopped in front of the mansion gates. The gates opened, the car rolled in, and the white gravel crackled beneath the tires. Tessa opened her eyes. She looked out through the glass and saw the house on the hill, saw the garden, saw the warm yellow light from the second-floor windows, and she saw a tiny figure running out from the front door, hair loose, bare feet, both little arms waving. Bree. Tessa opened the car door before the car had fully stopped. She stepped down, and Bree crashed into her, both tiny arms wrapping tightly around her mother's legs, her face lifted, smiling wide. "Mommy, you were gone so long. Did you buy Nana's medicine?" Tessa looked down at her daughter. The 4-year-old child knew nothing, didn't know where her mother had just been, didn't know what her mother had just gone through. In Bree's eyes, her mother had simply gone to buy medicine and taken a little longer than usual. And now her mother was home, and that was enough. Tessa bent down and hugged her child, held her tight, held her longer than she usually did. Then she smiled, her voice normal and gentle, as if today were only an ordinary day. "I bought it, sweetheart." Bree happily took her mother's hand and pulled her into the house, talking as she walked, telling her how Nana had taught her to draw roses that afternoon, how she had drawn 2 flowers, and Nana said they were very beautiful. Tessa listened, nodded, smiled in the right places, asked questions at the right moments. And no one looking at her now could have known that only a few hours earlier she had been sitting on an iron chair in an abandoned warehouse, her wrists red, looking straight into the face of the man threatening her and refusing to say a word. Margaret stood at the front door, leaning lightly against the frame. She watched Tessa walk in with Bree. The 2 women looked at each other. Margaret didn't ask, "Are you all right?" She didn't hug Tessa. She only nodded, slightly, one small nod whose meaning only the 2 of them understood. That nod said, "I know what you've just been through, and I'm still here." Tessa nodded back. Then she led Bree up the stairs, her voice still answering her child's question about the 3rd rose the little girl planned to draw tomorrow. Knox stood beside the car, watching the 3 women, one old, one young, one tiny, walk into the house he had sworn to protect. Then he turned to Walt. "Call a meeting. Tonight, 10 o'clock at night." Knox came down the stairs, dressed in a black suit, with Walt behind him. He passed through the first-floor sitting room, where Bree had been asleep upstairs for a long time, where Margaret had also returned to her room to rest. The house was quiet. Knox walked toward the front door, his hand reaching for the car keys on the shelf. Tessa stood in the hallway, her back leaning against the wall, in the exact place where she had stood the night Knox drove Dean Mercer away. She had been waiting here. She wasn't wearing sleep clothes. She was still wearing the same clothes from that afternoon, as if she knew Knox would be leaving tonight and had already been waiting for him. Knox saw her and stopped. Tessa didn't ask where he was going. She knew. She didn't ask what he was going to do. She knew that too. She only looked at him, then said, her voice soft but every word clear, "You saved me and my child. You don't owe me anything more. Don't do anything that would make Margaret lose her son." Knox looked at her. He looked for a long time. Tessa didn't lower her eyes, didn't take back her words, didn't apologize for having gone too far. She had spoken the truth, and she stood behind what she said. Knox didn't answer. He nodded, slightly, almost too faint to notice, then walked past her and out the door. But that sentence had entered his mind, and it would stay there throughout the night. The meeting took place at a private restaurant in downtown New Haven, on the top floor, in a closed room. Knox had called the meeting that afternoon, and when he stepped in, 4 men were already seated around the round table. The 4 largest families in the Northeast. Each man in that room controlled one sector, one territory, one force. And at the head of the table, sitting comfortably in his chair with a glass of liquor in his hand, was Ronan Voss. Ronan saw Knox walk in, lifted his glass in greeting, and smiled with confidence. "Donnelly, long time no see." Knox didn't return the greeting. He pulled out a chair and sat down, with Walt standing behind him. Knox looked around the table, looked at each face, then began to speak. He didn't say much. Knox never said much. He said exactly 3 things. First, there had been an insider inside his house. That person had been arrested and had confessed everything. Second, that insider had been directed by someone sitting in this room. Third, Knox had evidence. Ronan set his glass down, still keeping his smile. Donnelly, that's a serious accusation. I hope you have something more convincing than the confession of a traitorous butler. Knox didn't argue. He didn't look at Ronan. He nodded to Walt. Walt stepped forward, placed a phone in the middle of the table, and pressed a button, and the room heard it. The recording lasted less than 4 minutes. Perry Ashford's voice, clear and unmistakable, was speaking with another man. The content was the Donnelly Mansion security system information, Knox's schedule, the number of guards, and the location of the safe. And the other man's voice, the voice at least 2 men sitting in the room recognized immediately, belonged to one of Ronan Voss's closest men. Knox had installed a listening system right after discovering Perry's betrayal, before Perry was arrested, and that system had recorded every call Perry made during his final 3 days, including this one. Combined with Perry's official statement at the police station, the evidence couldn't have been clearer. The recording ended. The room went silent. 4 men looked at Ronan. Ronan sat still, his smile gone. He opened his mouth. That could be fake. Anyone could splice together. The police department has verified it, Knox said, cutting him off, his voice as even as if he were reading the weather. And Perry Ashford has signed a statement naming you. Do you want me to open that document for everyone to see? Ronan looked around the table. He searched for an ally. But the other 4 faces had changed. Not because they believed Knox. In this world, no one believed anyone. But there was an unwritten rule that all of them understood. Whoever got exposed, lost. It wasn't about who was right or wrong. It was about who could still stand, and who had been laid bare. Ronan had been exposed. The evidence was on the table. And no family wanted to sit on the same side as a man everyone in the room knew had already lost. One by one, they stood. None of them said a word to Ronan. They shook Knox's hand, nodded, then walked out. When the last man left the room, only Knox, Walt, and Ronan Voss remained. Ronan looked at Knox, his face stiff, his hand gripping the arm of the chair. He knew that tonight, everything he had built was over. No one needed to beat him. No one needed to shoot him. All it took was a 4-minute recording, and the silence of the men who had once called him an ally. Ronan stood, pulled his chair back, and walked toward the door. When he passed Knox, he stopped and looked at him, as if he wanted to say something, but then he said nothing. He stepped out. The door closed. Knox remained seated for a while. Walt stood beside him and asked quietly, "What's the next move?" Knox shook his head. "There are many ways to end a man. Not all of them need a coffin." Walt looked at Knox and asked nothing more. And perhaps in the 10 years he had followed Knox, this was the first time Walt had seen his boss win a war without using anything but his mind. Walt didn't know that the reason Knox chose this way, the reason he sat here instead of standing in front of Ronan in a dark alley, was because of a sentence spoken by a woman before he walked out the door tonight. "Don't do anything that would make Margaret lose her son." Knox Donnelly had heard it. And Knox Donnelly, for the first time in his life, chose another way. 1 week later, Gus came home. The hospital vehicle stopped in front of the mansion gate, and a nurse helped him down, but he waved her off, saying he could walk on his own. He walked slowly, his back a little more bent than before, his legs no longer as quick as they had been when he trimmed the trees every morning, but he walked on his own feet, along the white gravel path he had walked for so many years. Margaret stood waiting at the front door. When Gus came close, she stepped down from the porch and reached out her hand. Gus took it. The 2 elderly people stood there, in the middle of the path, holding hands, looking at each other. Neither of them said anything. There was no need. Gus was alive. Margaret was still here, and everything that needed to be said was already in that clasp of hands, in those eyes, in that silence. Then Margaret turned and led Gus into the house, slowing her steps to match his pace, patient and gentle, the way Tessa had once led her through the garden every afternoon. Bree heard the commotion and ran out from inside the house, her hair loose, her feet bare, a drawing paper in her hand. "Gus! Gus is home!" The 4-year-old child rushed toward him, not hugging him because Gus was walking slowly, but standing right in front of him, lifting the paper high, her eyes shining. "I drew this for you, Gus. Look!" Gus bent down and took the paper. It was a crayon drawing, crooked and rough in the way only children's drawings could be. A tall man stood beside a tree, holding a watering can. And that was Gus. An old woman sat in a chair, and that was Nana. A little girl stood in the middle, one hand raised, and that was Bree. And up in the sky, several butterflies flew, colorful, bigger than the people's heads in the picture because Bree liked drawing big butterflies. Gus looked at the drawing and smiled, a smile that wrinkled every line on his face. Then his eyes grew wet. He reached out and stroked Bree's head, his large calloused hand resting gently on the child's soft hair. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. Very beautiful." That afternoon, Knox called Tessa into his study. She knocked, stepped inside, and stood in front of the desk. Knox sat behind it, but today he wasn't sitting straight the way he usually did. He leaned back a little, his eyes red, clearly without enough sleep over the past few nights. His hand rested on the desk, not holding a pen, not holding papers, not holding a phone. It was the first time Tessa had ever entered this room and seen Knox Donnelly not busy doing something. He was only sitting there, and he looked tired in a way no one outside that room was allowed to see. Knox was silent for a long time. Then he spoke, his voice lower than usual. "Thank you." 2 words. From Knox Donnelly's mouth, those 2 words carried more weight than any speech. "You carried the cup of tea out to Gus every day. You didn't think it was anything important. But because of that, my mother is still sitting out there." He stopped and drew a breath. "Do you need anything?" Tessa stood still, looking at Knox. She thought for a moment, then she shook her head. "I don't need anything. I only need my daughter to be safe." Knox looked at her, looked for a long time, then nodded. "From now on, no one touches you or your child. I promise." Tessa said nothing more. She lowered her head slightly, turned, and walked out. The study door closed. Knox sat there a while longer, alone, then stood, stepped into the hallway, and walked toward the garden. The afternoon sun was soft. The garden Gus had cared for all those years was in its most beautiful season. Roses blooming along the path, purple lavender bushes beside the fence releasing a faint fragrance into the wind. Knox walked along the gravel path, his steps as quick as always, on his way to the rear building to meet Walt. But he stopped. On the lawn to the right of the path, Bree was sitting on the grass, crayons scattered around her, a large sheet of paper in front of her. She was drawing, her tongue poking out to one side because she was concentrating. Bree looked up, saw Knox, and her face lit up. She waved. Uncle Knox, come look at what I drew." Knox stood on the gravel path, looking down at the 4-year-old child sitting in the middle of the lawn, waving for him to come over. He hesitated. Knox Donnelly, the man whose name the entire underground world of the Northeast knew, the man even his enemies didn't dare look straight in the eye, stood there hesitating before a 4-year-old child. Then he stepped down onto the grass, crouched beside Bree, one knee touching the ground, his face level with hers. Bree pointed at the drawing, excited. "Look, Uncle Knox. This is Nana, this is Mommy, this is me, this is Gus." Then she pointed to the tallest figure in the picture, drawn with black crayon, standing in the corner with both arms spread very wide. "And this is you, Uncle Knox. You're very good. You protect everyone." Knox looked at the drawing. He looked for a long time, looked at the tall figure drawn in black crayon, both arms spread wide, standing in the corner of the picture, as if holding everyone inside it. A 4-year-old child saw him that way. Not as a boss, not as a dangerous man, not as the man everyone feared. Only as Uncle Knox, the person who protected everyone. Knox said nothing. He reached out and stroked Bree's head, lightly, awkwardly, the way someone did when he wasn't used to doing such a thing. Then he stood, nodded to Bree, turned, and walked back toward the house. Bree had already bent over to keep drawing, no longer paying attention. On his way inside, Knox passed the laundry area near the backyard. Tessa was standing there, shaking out a bedsheet before hanging it on the line. She heard the footsteps and turned around. The 2 of them looked at each other. Knox gave a slight nod. Tessa smiled. Neither of them said anything. There was no need. Then Knox walked on. Tessa turned back to hanging the laundry, and the afternoon inside the Donnelly mansion was peaceful, as if no storm had ever passed through it. That night, after Bree had fallen asleep, Tessa sat alone on the mansion porch. She sat on the stone step, her back leaning against a pillar, looking out at the dark garden. The night wind was cool, and the scent of lavender from the fence drifted faintly toward her, then dissolved into the air. She looked down at her hands. Those hands had been through so much. They had been tied, had scrubbed floors, had held Margaret in the middle of the night when she couldn't breathe, had pushed her daughter away from danger, had gripped the hand of a man in a dark warehouse after the ropes had been cut away. Tessa clenched her hands tightly, then slowly opened them again. She looked at her palms, at the calluses, at the faint lines in the yellow light spilling out from the window. Then she smiled, not a happy smile, but the smile of someone who knew she had survived, had made it through, and would never let anyone break her again. On the second floor, Margaret sat on the balcony, in the same wicker chair where she sat every day. She wasn't reading, she only sat there, looking down at the garden. The garden was dark, but she knew that out there were the rose beds Gus had just trimmed again that morning, the stone bench where Tessa often sat when she brought tea out to him, and the lawn where Bree sat drawing pictures every afternoon. She thought about Perry, about a man who had lived in her house for 8 years, eaten the food she provided, drunk the tea she brewed, been trusted by her with everything, and in the end repaid her with what had been placed inside the teapot. Greed had turned him into someone she no longer recognized. Then she thought about Tessa, about the girl who had come here with empty hands. No relatives, no money, nothing at all, only a small child and a pair of calloused hands. And every afternoon, she carried the leftover cup of tea out to the garden for Gus, an act so ordinary that no one noticed it. Yet that very act had kept Margaret sitting here tonight. Margaret thought life was strange. Sometimes, a stranger who arrived with empty hands became real family, while the person who had stayed beside you for 8 years was the one who wanted you gone from this world. The Donnelly mansion still stood there, on the highest hill in New Haven. Still the same house, still the same garden, still the same iron fence surrounding it. But inside, everything had changed. Not changed because things were worse or better, but changed because the ones who stayed were the ones with true hearts, and they knew the value of that. Perhaps the greatest lesson from this story can be held in only a few lines. Greed is a poison no one has to brew for you. It is born inside the human heart, grows silently, and burns down the very person who carries it. And sometimes, the smallest act holds the greatest power. A cup of tea carried out to the garden each afternoon, an innocent sentence from a 4-year-old child tugging an old woman's hand to go see butterflies, an ordinary kindness repeated every day without needing anyone to notice, can change an entire life. Live with kindness, not because someone is watching, but because that is the person you choose to become. If this story touched your heart, please press like and share so more people can hear it too. And if you want to follow the next stories, please subscribe to our channel so you won't miss them. How did this story make you feel? Which character moved you the most? Write it in the comments below so we can hear the feelings from your own heart. Thank you all for being here and listening until the very last minute. I wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and I'll see you again in the next video.